Hello, it's wonderful to see all of you here tonight. Nearly every military wife has a nightmare and a vision she hopes and prays never comes to pass. Mine came true on January 18th, 1991, on the third day of Operation Desert Storm. I was sitting at our kitchen table in Oceanside, California, absorbed in writing a letter to my husband. I hadn't seen him for 5 months. In August of 1990, he had deployed with his squadron to the Persian Gulf. And in the 5 months since, he had molded his squadron into a capable battle unit. And in the meantime, back home, I too had faced the challenge of creating unity. But my challenge was with the wives and the families back home. And like our men, we also bonded into somewhat of a capable battle unit. As in other military communities across America, our squadron wives and families struggled to stay calm despite failing peace talks, escalating tensions, and gloomy predictions of casualties for any hostilities that might break out. Then the January 15th deadline passed, and suddenly the war began. My husband was flying an OV-10 observation and reconnaissance plane, a very low-flying, slow-flying airplane whose job is to locate enemy targets for the attack jets swooshing by overhead. On that third day of Operation Desert Storm, absorbed in letter writing, I startled when the telephone rang, even though I knew the very strict protocol in notifying next of kin for military families. I had told my squadron wives over and over again, don't worry, if you receive bad news, you will be notified in person. Yet, dreading the bearer of bad news myself, every time the phone rang, I jumped. Well, on that day, it was my aunt calling, and we talked about the progress of the war and how well it was going compared to what everyone had expected. As we talked, I kept my eyes focused on the television screen in the adjoining room. Suddenly, I saw CNN flash a news bulletin that 2 American pilots had been shot down and were declared missing. I feel so sorry for the wives of those pilots, I said to my aunt. And instantly the doorbell rang. And I instantly knew why. As I walked toward our door, through the small window, I saw the outline of a Marine officer's cover or hat. And it confirmed my worst fears. And as the doors swung open and I saw the somber looks on the faces, I knew that the moment that I had dreaded had arrived. My husband's Marine Air Group commander, Colonel Don Beaver, walked into my home also with his wife Kay and another Marine officer. They told me that my husband's plane had gone out on a mission and not returned. There were no witnesses, no one saw a parachute, there were no signal beacons, there were no radio transmissions. And in the months before the war, I had imagined him coming home crippled. I had imagined him being killed, but I had never imagined that he would vanish. I didn't know that his plane had been shot down by a surface-to-air missile, that his backseat aerial observer had been knocked unconscious, and my husband had been able to eject both of them. I didn't know that he had almost been killed twice before he even hit the ground. And I'm almost glad I didn't know that at that moment he was a prisoner of war. And as an early captive, a senior Marine, and a commanding officer, he was a potential gold mine of information that the Iraqis so desperately needed. And I'm glad I didn't know that for him every minute was minute-by-minute survival as he resisted their demands. That evening I went to bed hoping against hope that he might somehow still be alive, but telling myself that I'd better assume he wasn't. And I couldn't help but wondering, well, now how long will it be before they find his body? Well, the next morning I had a new challenge. My husband's parents had been traveling in Arizona, but eventually the military had found them, and therefore the next of kin had now been notified. And my husband's name was released to the press. It seemed within minutes of that happening that I became cornered in my own home. I went upstairs at one point and looked out of the upstairs window and counted 14 news vehicles lined up end to end on our once quiet cul-de-sac. There were satellite dishes pointing up to the sky. News reporters were walking the street, ringing doorbells, looking for anyone who might talk with them. And one disturbing sight was my neighbor, who I barely knew, standing on his front lawn surrounded by reporters, talking rapidly while they vigorously wrote notes in their notebooks. Of all my neighbors, he was the only one, since my husband had left 5 months earlier, who hadn't asked how he was doing or offered help in his absence. What on earth could he be telling him, I had to wonder. My life had changed so quickly in just 24 hours. At this point, the telephone was ringing constantly. The moment it was replaced on the receiver, it would ring again. The doorbell was ringing. I had to go into the back of the home because more often than not, when the door opened, a camera would be thrust in as well. Many people were calling with condolences. I went upstairs and wrote in my journal, "It's no fun to be famous. At any other time, I might be impressed that Connie Chung would call to give me her home phone number, then offer to fly out on the next airplane. Instead, I feel invaded and used. My feelings are far less important than getting a story, emotional statements, pictures of me out of control, broadcasting my pain and sorrow." I was too proud to give them those images. The next day, Sunday, I learned that there was a more important reason for me to stay out of the limelight and not be photographed. I'd gone to bed Saturday night with no more news about my husband. Although I started receiving strange phone calls from friends and relatives. They'd been hearing rumors, odd pieces of information on the news about pilots being picked up, about signal beacons out at sea. And even the name Clifford David had been mentioned. And that was so close to my husband's name, Cliff Acree. I wondered if it was just a coincidence. But none of the reports were confirmed by the military, and we were watching CNN along with everyone else. So I went to bed with no new news. The next morning, I decided to get up and prepare a statement. I'd been silent until now, and I didn't want my silence to be interpreted as not caring about my husband. Another POW wife, or MIA wife at the time, had tearfully expressed her concerns on radio and television, and I didn't want my silence to be misinterpreted. So I decided to write a statement to let everyone know how much I loved my husband and my hopes for his return. Not knowing where to begin, I went up to the study and looked at some letters that I had written to him that were on the computer, yet he had not received because of the long delay in them receiving mail in the Middle East. So I decided to start out my statement using an excerpt from one of those letters that he could not have possibly read yet. What I included said, "You have some difficult times ahead of you. When you get tired and discouraged or overwhelmed, just think of the strong love that I have for you, and I'm backing you up and will be here for you, regardless of what happens. You can count on me for the long term." When I included that statement, I never knew how apropos it would be for the events that would take place in the next few days. Then I talked about Cliff and his dedication. He loved to fly, and he was very dedicated to the Marine Corps. Kay Beaver, who was helping me prepare the statement, suggested that I change those past tense references of him to present tense. He loves to fly, he is dedicated, and I thought it very nice of her to do that, considering he was probably dead. Well, it turned out that she and her husband knew something that I didn't. Momentarily, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, and my mother, who had flown down immediately to be with me, gave a strange cry, unlike anything I'd ever heard in my life. It was a rapid crescendo followed by a decrescendo, a very audible sound of good news and bad news all in one. Colonel Beaver came into the room and asked me to sit down for the second time in 3 days. And I told myself, this is it. They found his plane and he's in it. But what he told me wasn't that at all. What he told me was so incredible that they had some word that my husband might have been captured by the Iraqis and might now be a prisoner of war. And even more incredible, at any moment, he might be appearing on CNN. I immediately began rereading my statement and giving directions to some friends who were in the room. You proof this, I'll go ahead and write this next section. And one of them laughed and gave me a big hug, and she said, "Cindy's back, she's starting to boss us around." I never knew that I'd be so thrilled to know that my husband was a prisoner of war in Iraq. Finally, the next day, I was able to see my husband on television. I just got a quick glimpse. And it was a very chilling picture, and Americans were infuriated by this. But I was thrilled. I thought he was dead before that, but now I knew that at least at the time of the filming, he was alive. I took one look at him and I turned away from the television and I said, "He's okay. He's still fighting. I can see it in his eyes." And something that I noticed, even more important, was that out of all of the prisoners who were in the so-called interviews or interrogations, he was the only one who had not made a propaganda statement against the government, against the war, or against President Bush. And I knew that was no accident because of the type of person that he is. I knew that he paid very dearly for that resistance. And the integrity and courage that he showed at that moment gave me so much strength. And I decided that somehow I was going to fight right along with him throughout this ordeal. After my husband appeared on television, the press doubled their efforts to try to get a statement from me. And I knew at that point it was critical that I not do so, because in the information age, anonymity is impossible. And CNN estimated their worldwide viewing audience during the Gulf War at over 1 billion people. And we had to assume that Saddam Hussein was sitting down in one of his bunkers watching CNN. As it turned out, he was. And if I appeared on television and said something as inane as, "I really miss my husband and so does our dog," they might say, "All right, Colonel Acree, we've killed your dog and your wife is next." Or just having my face filmed or my voice recorded, they might distort that in somehow and say, "Here's what we've done to her so far. You know, we'll do worse if you don't cooperate." So I was bound and determined at that point not to be filmed or be in the limelight at all. Anything that I used could be used against him. I didn't know what he was telling them. Could even have told them he didn't have a wife. After 4 days in my home, with the doorbell ringing, the telephone ringing constantly, I really was in need of getting out of that house and escaping. And the only way I can describe the experience of that is if you were locked in your car for 4 days with the seatbelt warning going off continually, continually beeping, and being trapped and not being able to get out. Some friends had invited me to come down to their house if I could make it and walk our dog on their beachfront home in Leucadia, California. Luckily, the media did not know what I looked like, so with the use of a decoy, I was able to escape. I pretended that I was Colonel Beaver's wife, and he nearly had to push me out the door as if I was going down a dark city alley at night. And we walked out to his car. I put my arm around him and we sped off. At that moment, my garage door opened and some other people in my car backed out of the driveway, and they were followed by the media, so I was free. When I looked up in the sky, the sun was so bright and intense, the sky was so blue, and I only wished that Cliff was having that same opportunity because I knew that he wasn't. Well, the next day it was very interesting to read some of the newspaper reports. And despite the seriousness of the situation, we found quite a bit of humor in them. A lot of the newspaper reports were incorrect, and of course the television reports were too. One of them said that the Marines had hidden me somewhere aboard the base, Camp Pendleton. Another one said that the Marine wives had hid me in a safe house. I've always wondered what a safe house is, but the Marine wives thought that was hilarious because we were never that organized to be able to pull that off. And I was also a little chagrined to read about my neighbor who told the newspapers that he had volunteered to take the day off of work and serve as a spokesperson for the family. So that became our little joke. When someone asked me a question or make a decision, I would say, "Well, let me check with our family spokesperson and I'll let you know." I still had never spoken to any newspaper journalist or any television reporter. although Kay Beaver had read my prepared statement over the telephone many times. And many of the stations alluded to the fact that it was me saying those words. And I know a lot of my friends in Seattle must have wondered where I picked up that Texan accent. One of the newspaper reports, though, angered me because it was not a quote that I had said, and because of what it suggested. USA Today said, "Even the POW's comments critical of the U.S. role in the Gulf were welcomed." Said Cynthia Acree, wife of Marine Lieutenant Colonel Cliff Acree, "It's all we have to go on. He's alive." Well, after the news that Cliff was alive, I felt a jolt of adrenaline, and I was on a high, a feeling of euphoria. But then I began the long wait. After the television appearance, Saddam Hussein realized that his propaganda efforts had backfired, and he no longer televised any of his captives. So I began that very long wait, knowing that my husband was being held by the butcher of Baghdad. My frustration began to mount over the next few days. It was unbelievable, unbearable. Here was my husband in this precarious situation. I didn't know if he was being starved, tortured, or worse, and I knew there was something that I had to do. So I began to do research. I was bound and determined to make phone calls and knock on doors, knock them down if I had to find out what I could do to help him. I called Elizabeth Dole in Washington, D.C., who had recently been appointed as the head of the Red Cross. She was unavailable. I researched the Geneva Conventions to read about how prisoners should be treated in wartime. And I quickly learned that getting countries to obey the Geneva Convention is about as easy as getting Americans to obey the speed limit. It's not going to happen. I talked with several former prisoners of war from the Vietnam era who were very helpful to me. I called the Department of Defense. I called the Public Affairs for the Marine Corps, POW MIA Affairs. I made every phone call I could trying to find information. And I quickly learned that in this situation there were no experts. And there were lessons learned in Vietnam, but they weren't necessarily known by the people who were in charge during the Gulf War. I talk about some of the frustrations and the things I learned about this in the Gulf between us. However, one day I had a very interesting meeting with two Marine Corps counterintelligence officers. And they told me some fascinating things and some things that I didn't want to hear, but really had to ask about how an interrogation works and how they proceed with trying to get information from my husband and comparing notes with other prisoners. On the good side, they told me some very promising news, and that was that the Department of Defense had issued an unclassified message that if the American people wanted to do something to try to help our prisoners of war and those who were missing in action, they could write letters to the Iraqi ambassador to the UN demanding humane treatment of those that they held. That was all I needed to hear. And I decided at that point that I was going to start a massive letter writing campaign. I would talk to everyone I knew, everyone, and get them to join in this cause. And I decided that my goal would be 1 million letters sent or faxed to the Iraqi ambassador. And throughout my husband's captivity, I continually kept a vision in my mind of a CNN report and a journalist doing a stand-up in New York City, in front of the sidewalk, in front of the UN. And I visualized a huge dump truck backing up with the backup signal blaring and beeping, and the tailgate opening up, and this million letters falling out on the sidewalk and overwhelming everyone in sight. 4 days later, I held the first meeting with the founding members of the POW MIA Liberty Alliance. And the group that we started with grew and grew. We had people from all over the world that ended up helping us in our cause. The crusade quickly built into a nonprofit organization, and we had people from everywhere helping us. Over the next few weeks, I had many interesting experiences. I was very lucky to have the opportunity to involve many politicians and also Hollywood celebrities in our cause who were unbelievably helpful. And it was very, very heartwarming to see what they were willing to do, and also, of course, very patriotic Americans. Over the next several weeks, Cliff and I had very interesting experiences, which I talk about in The Gulf Between Us, but I wanted to share one of them with you tonight, because in writing the book, I would write about an experience that I had, and then I would ask my husband, what were you doing at that same time? And of course, he was keeping marks on the wall without a calendar or any communications, but he knew what happened every day. And there was an interesting juxtaposition of my high point and his low point, and I'd like to tell you about that. As I mentioned, I had the opportunity to meet many politicians, and my favorite was First Lady Barbara Bush. And you've probably all read about what a wonderful and warm person she is, and I will tell you that every one of those things is true. On the day that I met with her, I brought some information about my letter writing campaign and the organization, and I gave it to her in an envelope. We had a wonderful meeting, and then it was time for her to go. And as she was about to walk through the door, she paused and she turned, and she held the envelope over her head, and she said, "I'll give this to George tonight." Of course, I was thrilled. Talk about getting a message to the top right away. And I left that meeting with her with renewed confidence that my husband was going to come home safe, that he would be alive, and we would be reunited again one day. Little did I know that he was literally inches from being killed. That day he had endured a particularly brutal interrogation. As you might remember, before the ground war was to start, the air war intensified, and the Allies were really pounding Baghdad, trying to knock out additional communications equipment and intelligence areas. And they were becoming desperate again, knowing that something was going to happen. So again, they began to really put pressure on my husband to get information. And he had attended countless briefings of classified information before the war. He knew much more than he would ever want to know as a prisoner of war about many things. The Iraqis knew some information about the Air Force, and they also knew a little bit about the Army, because, unbelievable as it may sound, in years past we had trained Iraqis in schools here in the United States. But they knew very little about the Navy, and they knew almost nothing about the Marine Corps except their reputation, first to fight. And because it had been broadcast rather heavily in the media, they knew that the Marines were planning an amphibious assault landing with 10,000 or more Marines coming ashore. And my husband had attended briefings. He knew where this would be, approximately when it would be, and what the forces involved would be. And they were unmerciful trying to get information from him about that. On that day, he was interrogated by the most ruthless interrogator that he had had in his entire captivity. And he told my husband that he had one more day because he had refused all of the questions. He said, "If tomorrow you don't cooperate, we are going to chop up your body and send it home to your wife." Now, Saddam Hussein had done that very thing on more than one occasion to members of his own cabinet and other military officers. So my husband took that very seriously. He knew it wasn't an idle threat. And the interrogator also described to him in exact detail how he would perform that gruesome task. And he said that with each wrong answer that he gave, he would cut off a finger, and then another finger, and then he would just continue. So my husband knew that this was something that was going to happen to him tomorrow, because he was not going to endanger the lives of tens and hundreds of thousands of people. And tomorrow would be the day that he would die. Well, there was another divine plan in mind, I believe. I'd like to read to you an excerpt from the book where my husband describes what happened on that very night after that brutal interrogation, after he was thrown back in his cell. Sometimes during the nightly bombing, a bomb seemed to fall short of its target and land dangerously close to our prison. But on this night, something was different. A bomb dropped so close to the prison, the whole building shook. I knew another would follow, since stealth drops them in pairs. The next one came even closer. The explosion sucked the wind right out of me and threw me from one side of the cell to the other. I realized we were the target. Then came a third blast. It shattered tiles and blew out the only window in my cell, including the quarter-inch steel grid covering it. Pieces of the roof were falling and light fixtures exploded. Amid the sounds of shattering glass, I heard prisoners screaming and banging on doors, trying to get out. Our Iraqi guards had long since fled to an underground bunker. It was a helpless feeling, knowing we were being bombed and couldn't get out. Another jet screamed overhead. "Incoming!" another prisoner yelled. I did the only intelligent, manly thing to do. I crouched on all fours, pulled my blanket over my head, and prayed. Well, Cliff's prayers were answered. The prison that he was in was nearly destroyed. Unbeknownst to me at the time, Saddam Hussein had made good on his threat to use the prisoners as human shields. And the prison my husband was in was not only a prison, but it was one of the major Iraqi intelligence headquarters. Well, my husband never saw that ruthless interrogator again. He was moved to another prison. Although Cliff came near death on many occasions, he did survive to return home to me. And then we began perhaps our greatest challenge, which was struggling to regain the normal life that we had once had. But despite the challenges that we faced, Cliff and I have been very blessed. The ordeal we faced was short, and it had a happy ending. And it brought lasting friendships that can only be gained in such a time of crisis. It also brought lasting lessons. Spending 95% of his time in solitary confinement, Cliff had a lot of time to reassess his priorities. And believe me, it wasn't the new car and the big home. He'll never take for granted a soft bed to sleep in, or his next meal, or the country that refused to abandon him. For me, I learned that sometimes you don't realize how precious something is until you almost lose it. We have much to be grateful for. Cliff and I will always be indebted to the American people for their unity and their unwavering support of all of the troops in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. During our darkest moments, you sent prayers, words of encouragement, you wore POW bracelets, and you kept us in your thoughts. Albert Schweitzer once said, "Sometimes our light goes out, but is blown again into flame by an encounter with another human being. Each of us owes the deepest thanks to those who have rekindled this inner light. With your energy, sincerity, and your kindness, you rekindled us, and you have our heartfelt thanks for being the beacons in the storm, even a desert storm. Thank you very much." Don't be shy. Yes.
Why do you think that Cliff didn't get the recognition, some special type of recognition for what he went through? And
I think that there are several answers to that question. One is that everyone, including, I believe, the military, assumed that all of the prisoners of war were treated fairly the same. As you know, my husband was singled out for treatment because of the classified information that he had and the resistance that he gave. And I think there was assumption on the part of the American people and a lot of people that every prisoner of war was treated the same. And unfortunately, I think there are some lessons that he learned that have not been taken advantage of at this time, which I talk about in The Gulf Between Us.
Do you tell your children about the experience that your husband went through, or is it something that you don't want them to know a lot about?
Well, my children are now only 4 and 8.
Okay.
My 8-year-old knows that Mommy wrote a book and Daddy is the hero of the book. One of the questions that people often ask me about is, why did I write the book? And when my husband returned, of course, I was very concerned about what happened to him, and I wanted to be able to support him, and I very gently began asking him questions about what he had experienced. And the stories that he told me were so incredible and inspiring and at times bizarre that I knew this was a story I had to tell. And as he spontaneously began to recall incidences, I would write them on napkins, scraps of paper, and began to compile them on the computer. And I knew that this was a story that he was too modest to tell, and that I had to tell him for it. And as I began writing the book, I kept realizing that the happy ending of us rushing into each other's arms was not the true ending of the book. And that's why I did not come out with a book shortly after his return, because that was really only part of the story. Anytime you go through a crisis like this, you can't help but to be different people. And the story doesn't end with that fairy tale ending. So I wanted to write a book with a perspective of looking back several years on how does something like this change you forever and change your relationships with other people. And so that's what I've talked about in the book.
Are you still involved with the POW MIA organizations to share that with other wives and families?
I am somewhat involved with other POW and MIA organizations. Of course, it's an issue that's very dear to my heart, and I read everything that I can on that subject. My husband has always told me that historically there is a major conflict about every 25 years. And, you know, I hate to count 25 years from 1991, but possibly we want to have another one. And I do hope if we do, and if, God forbid, we do have more prisoners of war and people that are missing in action, then I can give some solace and some support and advice to those families on the things that I went through, because the answers are not readily out there. One of the things that I talk about is trying to find information on protocol. What should I be doing as the wife of a prisoner of war? Should I go on camera and plead for his release, or you know, try to get a letter writing campaign going by a lot of publicity that way? And what was interesting is a friend of mine, whose friend was someone who was in the CIA for quite some time, asked him, well, isn't there some protocol for families of CIA members who are taken hostage on what they should do and how they should behave? So he did some research and came back to her and said, yes, there is a body of knowledge, but it's classified and I can't tell you. And that pretty much was the experience that I had all over. You really had to dig for information.
I've got a question real quick, ma'am.
Yes.
I kind of walked in at the end of this, and I really wish I would have got here for the beginning of it, because it was very interesting what I did here. Did your husband ever talk to you at all about the training that he received in the military, and if it helped him out at all in his situation?
When I met with those counterintelligence officers, one of the first questions that I asked them was, has my husband been through SEER training? And as I'm sure you know, that's search, evasion, rescue, and escape training, where you go through a simulation of being a prisoner of war. And their answer was, no, he hasn't been through that. So, but my husband survived and used a number of tricks that he did a lot of reading about Vietnam POWs and about that issue, and he thought of those on his own. But I think that that's 50% of what got him through. The other 50% is just pure guts and determination and will. And that's something that you're not going to learn in any military training. And that is something that he received from his upbringing as a child. And I believe, and he has told me that his military training in the Marine Corps hardened him from officer candidate school on. And all of that hardening helped him survive what he did. Yeah. Don't be shy. Yes.
I'd like to ask, what was the gulf, what was the biggest or deepest gulf between you? I think it's awfully hard when somebody comes back from an experience like that.
Yes.
To reestablish the relationship that had been between you. And you,
absolutely.
What was the hugest gulf? I mean, obviously.
Well, as you're bringing up a very good point, very insightful. In the gulf between us, I write about two gulfs. There was the physical gulf of being 10,000 miles apart, And then there was the emotional gulf of coming back and trying to assimilate the experiences that we had been through. And I think every military member will tell you that when they go on a 6-month deployment, when they return, there are many adjustments to be made. They've both lived different lifestyles, and suddenly they're trying to meld the two again. So my husband and I went through that, but we also went through some other issues. For him, it was an adjustment to be in a room without bars. And when he came back to our home, he had not seen it for 7 months. And he walked around our home almost in a trance of wonderment. And he ran his fingers along the table. He looked out every window because he had dreamed of being there for so many months and never believed that he would actually be there again. So for him, it was an adjustment to be a free man, to be able to sleep through the night and not be startling with every noise. There are a lot of things that he went through. My biggest adjustment was learning that he was no longer my husband, he was a hero. And even though no one knew what he had been through, just because he had been in the Gulf War and because he had been a prisoner of war, people flocked around him. And one of the things that I talk about in the book that I learned to get used to was when he would give a presentation like this, usually it was for hundreds of people, I have to be careful not to get mowed over of people, you know, rushing past me to shake his hand. And I was very happy for him, and it was wonderful. But I literally became the woman standing behind her man during those times, and I had to share him. And we had been apart a long time and we had only been married less than 2 years when he went over to the Gulf. So we had a lot of living to do, even though, as you'll learn in the book, we had known each other for almost 20 years before we got married. We met when I was 16, and we studied karate together and earned our black belts together. So we had a lot of time to make up for, and unfortunately, we didn't have that, and we spent a lot of time in front of audiences. So writing the book was actually a nice catharsis for me, because finally I was able to tell my story, something I hadn't had the opportunity to do. One of the things that my husband and I always laugh about is when we would do a television interview, they would ask him 100 questions and they would ask me too, and sure enough, when it was broadcast, I would be edited out and they would just show me looking adoringly up at him. And whenever I did get to talk, he'd say, "You got to talk, you got to talk, isn't that great?" So now I'm doing a lot of talking. What other questions can I answer for you? Well, I'd be very happy to talk with you individually after the presentation, and I thank you very much for coming and allowing me to share my story.
I have one more question out of curiosity. What did he want to eat when he came home? Well, the thing is, I've lived overseas where I couldn't get American food, and I just, the first things I wanted to eat, I remember clearly. So what?
Oh, he had a tremendous amount of fantasies about food. None about me. He was too tired. Too tired and weak. He dreamed of a hot fudge sundae with Spanish peanuts. That was his number one desire, believe it or not. And of course, my cooking. He was sure, you know, to assure me of that. But that was the number one thing. Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate you coming tonight.